Following the collapse of a very controversial Roblox community, a new one would arise, one that was much more stable compared to its predecessor. But how long would this last? Leaders from inside the community wanted more power, and they would use Roblox as their virtual battleground. The Roblox military community has been a staple on the platform since its conception, and this was no different in 2016. Large groups of players formed factions on an agreed-upon map. This would be the virtual battleground for these clans and factions. Wars were waged at a pretty massive scale, players coordinating battles with the goal of claiming hegemony, as they call it. You're going to hear that word a lot in this video, so to explain it very quickly, it's essentially just the word for the strongest faction on the platform, the community with the most influence, essentially. The main factions to point out at this time would be Lakedaimon, Athens, and Macedon. All the way to the left of the map would be Syracuse and Carthage, and all the way on the opposite side is the Bosporan Kingdom. Inside each nation were their own respective games, uniforms, but most importantly, hundreds of players. My last video went into detail about a pretty disturbing Roblox faction, which was an attempt at the replication of the Roman Empire on the Roblox platform. In this video, I briefly mentioned a set of Greek roleplay factions, which to this day are still fairly active. When I was researching for the previous video, I fell down this huge rabbit hole. But in comparison to the fallen Roman faction, the Greek community was much more complex. But they have an interesting story to share, one that you may not be expecting. This video is going to feel like a history documentary. So please, grab a snack and get comfortable, because this is going to be one hell of a ride. There was one important aspect of this community that was noticeably missing. There wasn't a Rome, or in other words, the hegemony. And after the fall of your Caesar's Rome, which I had mentioned in the previous video, tons of new Roman factions would spawn as a result. But for the sake of the video, we're just going to focus on two of these factions, undoubtedly the most influential during the time. The two leaders fighting for the throne of Rome were Augustus Julius Caesar, or AJC for short, and a player named Warren. These two Romes were noticeably different. Both Warren and AJC came from outside of the genre, sensing opportunity, and as a result, they had inexperienced armies and relatively no connections. The two Roman factions were in a cold war of sorts, competing to recruit the most members and developing the greater games. But the shift in power would change, suddenly. A group of veterans from the now fallen Your Caesar's Rome, which was, again, the Rome I talked about in the previous video, was known as the Great Family, and they were still pretty active in the community, but with no place to call home. That would be until Warren approached them with an offer to lead his personal guard, nicknamed the German Guardsmen. This would greatly shift the power in Warren's favor, and for a moment, it looked like Warren would win this Cold War. But AJC had a different strategy, and it involved money. AJC's Rome was launching advertising campaign after ad campaign, bringing in tons of new people into the genre, and tons of activity into his games. But he needed a way to break even. He was spending a lot of money to bring people into his faction, and surely there had to be a way to get at least a fraction of the money back. AJC would use a tactic that was undoubtedly controversial for this genre: microtransactions, but more specifically, pay for ranks. People were able to buy their way into Rome's Senate and their council, as well as buy cosmetics like capes and armor, and these were not cheap. AJC was allegedly making hundreds of dollars from these game passes, and this would attract the attention of someone important to the story, the great Alexander. He saw potential for massive growth and monetization in AJC's Rome, and this would entice him enough to leave Warren behind, taking his following with him to the rival Roman group. Warren, after hearing word of this, would crucify any supporters of the great Alexander, but the damage was already done. Warren's Rome had fallen as quickly as it started, and AJC was now the hegemon of the genre. The nations of Greece weren't too fond of this. Someone from outside of the community had come in and claimed the throne of the largest faction. Greece was here first, many years ahead of AJC's Rome, and they were determined to do something about it. The cultures between Rome and Greece were completely different. Rome, like I had said before, focused more on the public appeal aspect, if that makes any sense. recruiting with paid advertisements and creating appealing games for the average Roblox player. This was great for the genre. After the fall of Your Caesar's Rome, tons of people had left the community, but AJC brought in tons of new people, balancing out the loss and even growing the genre as a whole. These new people, however, were inexperienced with the combat technology, and as a result, not much attention was placed onto Rome's military. Instead, however, roleplay and government were the focus. Greece, on the other hand, was almost completely the opposite. Lakedaimon was led by a user named Polynices, along with a few friends named Theopompus and Aristocles. They were focused on creating a historical atmosphere on the platform while maintaining their grip on the community as a whole. And the way to cement your power in this community was through war. The majority of the Greek factions would come together, led by Lakedaimon. So Lakedaimon would decide to do something pretty interesting. They would declare war on Rome. I cannot find any official declaration or any reasoning behind the war, and there's little to no documentation regarding the battles, but we do know the outcome of the war. There was one battle that was recorded, and it was this one. And as you can see, the scale was massive. Hundreds of players gathered for this war, from both Greek and Roman factions. Rome still had Greece outnumbered, however, sometimes even doubling the Greek armies. But the war would be far from easy for Rome. Rome would only win one of the battles, while Lakedaimon won two. This is where the war would ultimately end. Rome would surrender, sending out a document to their Discord server, and stating all Romans are to withdraw from the war. This would be pretty embarrassing, and I'm sure at some point they wish they could just delete everything in their server and start over. But that would take a pretty long time to do. With an app like redact.dev, however, it would be a much easier process. Thankfully, they are the sponsor of today's video. Redact.dev is a service that allows its users to clean up their digital footprint, mass deleting messages, posts, and other content on over 30 supported applications. Whether you just want to get rid of any cringe messages you sent from years ago, or maybe you just want to tailor your online presence and start on a fresh slate. I use Redact.dev to go through some of my old Discord messages and clean them up. I was able to clear out my DMs or remove any messages I may have sent to specific servers. I highly recommend checking them out. Make sure to use my link from the description or the pinned comment, or my code, ROOT10. It would help the channel massively. And thank you again to Redact.dev for being the first sponsor on this channel. The war would serve some devastating consequences for Rome. For starters, some of their legions would defect to the Greek states, including the 10th Legion, which was led by Commander Barry 1611.
Yeah, I went to Lakedaimon as well. The 10th Mounted Legion went to Lakedaimon as well, bro. So like after the war, like the whole morale was lower and we were just pissed, obviously. And then we realized it wasn't really our fault. It was kind of the fault of the people above us. So out of protest, we left, and it caused a lot of notable commanders to switch over to the Greek factions because the Greek factions valued immersion and historical accuracy over monetization.
The majority of these Roman legions would join Lakedaimon, making this already powerful faction even more powerful. And at this point, Rome had separated itself from the rest of the genre. They no longer wanted to supply the Greek world with any activity or development. They wanted to focus on themselves, and Greece was once again alone. But they had a massive problem that needed to be solved: Lakedaimon. The influence and numbers Lakedaimon had over the rest of the Greek world was hard to miss. But they were the hegemon of the Greek factions, and this was about to be put to the test. A bunch of Greek factions would come together and meet Lakedaimon on the battlefield to contest their hegemony. Both sides would meet with equal numbers, roughly 80 men each. The battlefield included a river, a small town, and a big open plain in the middle. Once the war horn was sounded, the two massive lines of infantry charged towards each other, never looking back. The clash was intense, but the Spartans managed to break through the left flank, causing the Greek factions to pull back. The majority of the lines, however, were caught in a flank and were eliminated. The rest of the Greek army fell back into the town, defending from inside the houses. But it was no use. The Lakedaimon army went house after house, finishing off the Greek army. But just as Polynices and his army were finishing off the Greeks and their army, another Greek army was marching towards Lakedaimon, going around the site of the battlefield, hoping to capture them by surprise. But waiting for them was a brick wall, and Themistocles and his army would stop the Greeks in their tracks, and the Spartans would form a wall, waiting for the Greeks to arrive, And so they did. When the moment was right, Themistocles and his army pounced, charging into the Greeks. And of course, the Greek army was just no match for the well-experienced Spartans, and they would quickly rout. Lakedaimon had fended off all of Greece, at least for now. They held on to the title of hegemon, seemingly uncontested. But this wouldn't last very long. Carthage, which was a faction located in North Africa, wasn't too fond of their hegemon neighbor, and they would do something the other Greek states wouldn't dare to do. They would on their own engage with Lakedaimon, hoping to grab the hegemony for themselves. Carthage was led by a user named Diocles. Diocles would command the army, hoping to topple the Spartan regime, but his first few battles did not go the way he would have liked. In fact, he lost the first 2 major engagements, but he was poised to change the direction of this Roblox war. With one last battle, Diocles and his army were stationed in a fort within Carthage territory, awaiting the main army from Lakedaimon, and it wouldn't take long for them to arrive. A huge army from Lakedaimon, here to siege the castle and end the threat from Carthage. The huge army would appear from the woods and form at a nearby bridge. They had a brief moment of silence before the attackers would charge, attacking the main gate and climbing the walls. There were just too many of them. Diocles and his army were getting overwhelmed, and one by one, his soldiers were eliminated. The siege was lost, and Diocles surrendered, effectively collapsing Carthage as a whole, and Lakedaimon was still standing. Lakedaimon seemed unbreakable at this point. They had a firm grip over the genre of factions, and that would be clear until a new foe would appear from the east, Phrygia, led by Metrodoros. The hordes of Phrygia were moving fast, and they had their eyes set on Greece. Lakedaimon would have to gather a huge army, and fast. So Polynices gathered every regiment and every commander he had, and this was a huge army. 130 players attended the battle on the lake side, which was pretty massive for the time. But the Phrygians were quick to match these numbers. They mustered their commanders, and they levied around 120 soldiers. And now the stage was set. The future of Greece laid upon this battle, and neither of these factions had any idea what they were about to witness. Both of the armies would meet on a familiar battlefield, a river, 2 bridges, and a small town. Both armies would completely fill the battlefield, awaiting the sound of the war horn. The Spartans seemed to be losing the initial engagement. The lines were breaking one by one, so the order to retreat was called, and across the river they went. And now, the only thing separating these 2 hordes were the 2 bridges. Both armies fought fiercely at these bridges, coordinating attacks across the bridge and pulling back in swift motions. It was anyone's battlefield, until, from behind, Metrodoros, along with an army of skirmishers, would march towards the flank, hoping to catch the Spartans by surprise. Polynices would quickly gather 2 regiments and bring them to the flank to face the enemy skirmishers. But it wouldn't take him long to realize he was outnumbered, so he had to run back to the nearest bridge, gather some more men from Themistocles, and run back to the flank, in hopes he would be able to hold them off for long enough. But he wouldn't have to wait long. The northern bridge managed to slip past Phrygia's lines and make a major breakthrough. Phrygia's northern army was now in retreat, hoping to be reinforced by the southern army. But the southern bridge would also break, and the Spartans initiated an army-wide charge. Lakedaimon would just barely win the battle, and Phrygia went home to recuperate. For the first time ever, though, Lakedaimon's hegemony crown had been shaken. So far, at least to me, the story's been very fascinating to follow. Imagine just hundreds of Roblox players crafted these events and battles straight from the history books. It's pretty cool, and I hope you found it pretty cool as well. There's tons of more stuff like this on my channel, and I recommend you guys check the other videos out. Thank you guys. Have a good one. I'll see you next time.